Welcome back to All Things Creepy. I'm your host, Micah James. And this week, I'm not going to lie to you guys, this episode is going to be a little bit shorter, but I did have a lot of things going on during the week, so I didn't have a lot of time to give you like a meatier episode, but I'm hoping that next week will be a little bit longer. But this week, I am talking about creepy historical events. Because this episode is so short, I do plan on revisiting this topic as it was fun to go down this rabbit hole. So I thought this was also a good jumping off point. So if you know of any creepy historical events that I'm not going to be covering in this episode, please hit me up. All of my socials will be in the show notes, and I will cover it in the next time I talk about creepy historical events. All right, so the first one I am going to be talking about is Pope Pius VIII's funeral. Now, I know this sounds wild, but hear me out. Pope Pius VIII had served as the Pope from 1939 until his death in 1958 at the age of 82. He was so devoted to God that he insisted on keeping his body the way it was created after death. Like, he didn't want like an autopsy. He didn't want any of his natural fluids to be drained or for him to be filled with embalming fluids, nothing like that. The Pope's physician at the time, Riccardo Galeazzi Lissi, wanted to respect this request and decided not to drain the body of its natural fluids. To try to keep the body looking as best as it could look for being a dead body, Riccardo ended up using these experimental oils and resins before wrapping the corpse in plastic. Unfortunately, due to the heat and lack of air circulation in the room where the corpse was kept, the body started to decompose. Now, here's the thing. By the time it was time for the procession, the body turned green. And during the procession, the Pope's chest ended up imploding. The second one I am going to be talking about, I simply, in my notes, called it the baby farmer. So it does start with New Zealand's capital punishment. It was established in 1840 and it was eventually abolished in 1989. During those almost 150 years, 85 inmates had gotten the sentence. However, only one woman ever received this punishment, a baby farmer named Minnie Dean. Basically, Minnie would pay people for their babies, calling it quote-unquote adoption. Once the babies were in her care, many would mysteriously die or disappear. Despite the high infant mortality rate at the time, these deaths under Minnie's care had exceeded the norm. And so because of that, eyes were on Dean. Now, there aren't enough records from this time to determine exactly how many deaths happened. This could be simply because these documents were lost at time, or they just didn't care enough to keep these documents going. But what is confirmed is that 3 bodies were found in Minnie Dean's garden, and she was ultimately hanged on September 2nd, 1844. The next one we're talking about takes us to the battlegrounds of Waterloo. So many people might know of the Battle of Waterloo, or at least have heard of it, but not many. Many of you might not know about the 60,000 soldiers who ended up losing their lives. Their bones were used to help with English gardening. A whole year after the battle, the bones of both soldiers and horses were collected and converted into like this powder. Newspapers of the time reported that there were more than 1 million bushels of human and inhuman bones hauled off the field. This powder was then used to create this fertilizer to help crops grow. Because of how many bones were recovered from the battleground, it's predicted that a generation or two actually were able to use this fertilizer to help their crops. Next, we're going to talk about how George Washington was almost a zombie. Now, here's the thing. America's first president wasn't really going to be turned into an actual zombie, but that didn't stop Dr. William Thornton from trying to bring Washington back to life. It started with Martha Washington promising George that he'd live to see the year 1800. Unfortunately, he ended up dying on December 14th, 1799, just weeks before the new year. Martha ended up calling Dr. Thornton, who was one of the most prestigious physicians of his time. He had a simple plan to hopefully bring the president back to life, if not just to see the year 1800, at the very least. So the plan started with wrapping George Washington in blankets to bring his body temperature back up. As the temperature increased, the doctor would pump air into Washington's lungs. To start his heart back up, Dr. Thornton would inject the president with sheep's blood. Either surprisingly or unsurprisingly, this plan was not improved. But over the next 20 years, Dr. Thornton believed this experiment would have successfully brought back President George Washington, like I said, at least long enough to see January 1st, 1800. And finally, we are gonna end on animal trials. Now, this is something that's not so creepy or disturbing, at least compared to the other 4 historical incidents. But basically, in the 1400s, there were European countries like Switzerland, Italy, and France who would put animals on trial. So these animals would be like rats or pigs or locusts, and these trials would happen in both secular and religious courts. In secular hearings, animals would be prosecuted. One case included a pig with her 6 piglets who are on trial for assaulting a 5-year-old boy. The mother of the piglets was found guilty and sentenced to death, while the babies were acquitted as there was no proof that they had actually participated. The owner was charged with negligence and nothing else. Since he was responsible for those pigs, basically he could have stopped them. That was basically the logic. In religious courts, pests like locusts and rats were accused of stealing crops, were eventually excommunicated from the church. So that's all of the creepy historical events that I have for you guys this week. Again, if there's any that you want me to cover when I finally come back to revisit this topic, let me know and I will cover it. So yeah, all of my socials will be in the show notes if you want to reach out. So I will see you guys next week.